Hello, everybody. We're back with our weekly chat with author Kevin McAleer on all things literary, or many things literary, I should say. The past 7 or 8 weeks, we were examining the books of various LA/and/or Hollywood writers. Raymond Chandler, James M. Cain, Charles Bukowski, John Fonte, Nathaniel West, Bud Schulberg, Bret Easton Ellis. And this week, we're going to take a different turn. We're going to go all the way to Columbus, Ohio, with somewhat of a humorist writer named, as you may well know, this person, James Thurber. Kevin suggested this author. I didn't know he was an author. I thought he was a cartoonist, which he is, but I didn't know he wrote books of any sort. Maybe I knew a few short stories that he had written, knew about that. But I didn't know he actually wrote an autobiographical kind of work called My Life and Hard Times. And Kevin suggested Thurber and My Life and Hard Times. So I did my due diligence. I got the book, My Life and Hard Times, and I even found a DVD about him called The Life and Hard Times, which I watched. So I did my homework here. I'd like to ask Kevin why he chose Thurber and My Life in Hard Times for starters here. Go ahead, Kevin.
I had the book, and that's sort of the prerequisite, as you and I discussed. We'll let you folks in on what the process is here. Might be interested. I have a lot of books that have accumulated over the years in America and now here in Germany, living here for the past 3 decades. And in fact, I had our mother send me a whole bunch of books about 16, 17 years back. So I preserved a pretty good, solid library. You see some of the books back here. There are also some to the right. There are some in another room. And I got a library of about, I don't know, 600 or 800 books, but this is the creme de la creme over the years, and I have lived in about a dozen. I counted them recently. I've lived in about a dozen places in Berlin, and every time I move, everyone knows this, you throw stuff out, and people may cringe at the idea of me throwing out books, but I do. I throw out books. You can't sell them. They fetch you a pittance with bookstores. It's not even worth it. So I just throw the stuff out that I'm no longer interested in, if I ever was, but stuff that I've just accumulated. They've become detritus over the years. I've had about 2, at the outside, maybe 3 times as many of the books I have right now, just to give you some idea. And so any books that make the cut are good books in my book. And My Life in Hard Times is one of them. And I have an old paperback edition. Goes back, I think, 1948 or something like that. Doesn't matter. It's old. And yeah, I like old books. This isn't one I would probably have thrown away, even if I didn't much care for it. But I do remember liking it. I first read it about 25 or 30 years ago. Not this edition. I got a lot of my books back then when I'd first moved to Berlin from the John F. Kennedy Institute for American Studies. It's affiliated with the Freie Universität Berlin, the Free University of Berlin, established by the Americans after the Second World War in the western part of Berlin, because the former Berlin University was in the eastern half. So they needed to establish something in their western half. Eastern half, of course, Soviet occupied. And I used to get a lot of books there. And a lot of those books were actually from that period that came over from Americans donating them to Germans. And America Häuser, America houses, which were a thing back then to spread American culture. And a lot of these books had assembled in this John F. Kennedy Library. So I would come across books like this, old ones, circa 1948, 1950, 1952, which was also interesting for me because these were the books of my youth, going to the Reseda Library in the early, mid, late 60s. Our mother would load us up in the car and we'd go and get our books, and, the same vintage of books, 10, 15, 20 years old. So I liked going there, and I would discover and rediscover authors. And one of the authors that I discovered, and I, like you, Tim, thought he was just a cartoonist. I'd come across his name, and I thought he was a cartoonist, in particular because one of the books in our father's library, and he was a member of the Book of the Month Club before he got married, even into his marriage, I don't know. But he had a lot of books, like Hawaii by James Michener, Day of Infamy about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, King of Paris, I forget who that was by, but I remember all these books, their spines, they accompanied my childhood. And one of the books, if I'm not mistaken, was a book called Alarms and Diversions. 1957, I'm looking at it right now, I jotted it down, which was by James Thurber, which is an anthology of stories. But I never read the stories when I was a kid. I'd take it down, I'd look at the pictures. So I should have been aware that Thurber was more than just a cartoonist, just by the fact that our father had this book where his stories were, but I didn't register it. I was looking at the goofy pictures. And you all know Thurber and his art, even if you're not aware that it's James Thurber. He's got a very sort of naive, I guess would be the term, style. And I guess what people mean when they use that term is it looks like it could be done by a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or something. But they're very charming in their own way, particularly with the right caption. Here's a class. Here's not a classic, but here's kind of, you can see the figures. Those are the figures, very minimalistic.
Bring it up a little bit closer.
Drawings.
A little bit closer.
A little closer.
There you go. Now we got it.
Yeah, just line drawings. Nothing much to it.
Yeah.
But and all the people look alike. That is to say, all the men look alike pretty much, and all the women look alike pretty much. They're all wearing these baggy, look like potato sacks of dresses, and the women are always rather hefty, and the men
closer.
And the men are sort of mousy, often wearing spectacles. They're dominated by their wives or the women otherwise in their life. And it's no accident that Thurber is also the author of what is probably his most famous work, and which most people, I think, will have recognized. Will recognize when I say it. It's The Secret Life of Walter Mitty. He wrote that short story just to give you guys a point of identification from the very beginning. If you're not familiar with the story, you might know the film with Danny Kaye. I think it was 1946, 47. And it's about this, rather ineffectual, hapless, to use a term from What Makes Sammy Run, nebbish kind of guy. And he's dominated by his wife, who is not just a dominating wife, but she's a real harridan, a real shrew, a virago, battle axe. And that's sort of like the Thurber woman, at least in his cartoons. And this has been transposed now to the story, The Secret Life of Walter Mitty, where the where the henpecked husband, he's driving his wife into the city. She's got to buy something or visit a dentist. And she's going, I hope you didn't forget this, and you're driving too fast, and all that kind of thing. And then in in intervening moments when he's not henpecked, not put upon, he will fantasize about being a heroic figure, like someone taking on a suicidal bombing mission for the RAF in the Second World War, because the story takes place in the war years. Or he passes a hospital on his way in his car, and he starts fantasizing about being a world-renowned surgeon. Yes, holding up his hands. Yes, nurse, scalpel, and this kind of thing. And the final scene is where he's smoking a cigarette and he's standing against a wall and he's fantasizing that he's standing before a firing squad, but with great aplomb, with supreme savoir-faire, smoking his cigarette. And the final line, if I recall correctly, is something like, "There he stood, inscrutable to the end." And this is a great story. This is a great character. And we have, in fact, used the term ever since, Mitty-esque, or the name Walter Mitty, to define someone who has a fantasy life because they can't live that fantasy out in their real life. So his work has been absorbed into the language, if only in that one respect. So I wanted to come back to My Life in Hard Times. I have the book, and reread it, because I hadn't read it in a couple decades. And it was also, I think, of moment for us in our podcast, because we had done Charles Bukowski recently, and you're not going to believe this, folks, but Bukowski always cited Thurber as a big influence. And why did he do that? Because Thurber, he was a New Yorker writer, total middle-class writer, not life on the wild side, not this kind of degenerate, low-life world that Bukowski and much of his stuff occupies. And you might wonder why. Well, Bukowski says it, and he said it in so many words in Ham on Rye, the one book we did review, his autobiographical LA novel. He said, well, Thurber just knows that everyone's crazy. And you read this book, My Life in Hard Times, and you get more than an inkling of that attitude toward life, toward people, toward the world, that we're all a bunch of nuts and we're just muddling through, and it's one big zany madcap comedy. And yeah, I share that Weltanschauung to a degree, I have to say. So I thought I would go back and read a book by a kindred spirit. So that's what motivated me to suggest this book today.
And you read it many, many years ago. How did you feel about it this time around?
I wasn't as enthused.
Okay.
For one thing, the book is a very short book. That's the one thing I am enthusiastic about. I like short books. I think that writers go on and on and on, much too long. You can, I'm famous for saying, you can cut like half of the canon in American literature by half. Moby Dick could easily be cut by half, and it would only improve for the cutting. I still believe that. I still believe it would. And other books.
You mentioned For Whom the Bell Tolls as something that you felt could use a nice edit.
Oh yes. That could be cut again in half, and much to its profit. So I like short books, and this book is, I counted the pages because for each illustration, there's about 25 or so illustrations. There's a blank page. So even this little thin book, what it amounted to in terms of total pagination is 86 pages of large print text on very small pages. Okay, there you can see it right there. 86 pages of that. That's barely a novella. It's a very long, short story. But great. I love that. Pithy, succinct, concise. Love it. However, I think that this could have borne even greater concision. A lot of the chapters, and they're talking about his life growing up in Columbus, Ohio, as you mentioned, his birthplace, and where he went to school to Ohio. He went to Ohio State University. So this is his purview, most definitely. He knows what he's talking about, and he's writing about his immediate family and his social circle. But I think that some of the chapters go on too long because they're kind of one-trick ponies. Like the day the dam broke. I think that goes on too long. I think he could have told this story in 3 or 4 pages. It's about how rumor gets around that a dam broke and everyone, they take off for the hills, literally, assume some high ground. And it's talking about how it was not the case. The dam never broke. And you got all these people just going crazy. Here's a picture of it. Nice, zany, madcap pic. You can see that one, right?
Yeah, hold it up a little bit more. There you go. Yeah, that's a good view.
Yeah, that's a good picture.
Yeah.
And he could have just almost kept the picture with a 3 or 4 line caption, in my view, because that's all it is. It's about people acting on a false rumor, and the hijinks ensue. Well, the hijinks go on too long. So there are a couple more stories like that. Another one is the night the ghost got in. I just think they go on too long. We get it. We get the joke after the first few pages, and maybe it's because of my late 20th century, early 21st century sensibility, where we're constantly being distracted by stuff, and joke there, joke here. Grew up with sitcoms, the Munsters, the Addams Family, laugh tracks. Boom, boom, boom. 23 minutes, you're done. With commercials a half hour, but interspersed. Maybe my attention span has just been attenuated because of the generation that I belong to. But I was getting impatient with a couple of the stories. They went on too long, and they weren't, as I had originally recalled them, all that funny. Now, it has to be said that this isn't slap your knee hilarious humor most of the time, although there are a couple passages which did have me laughing out loud. It's what we in the trade, and I say we in the trade because I like to write humorous prose. I think all of my books, even my serious scholarly work, has a lot of jokes in it. Okay, and I try to be ironic, and the term I'm going to now use for my life in hard times, sorry, sometimes I have blanks, is droll, D-R-O-L-L. Very droll humor. Now, do we know what droll means? well, it's this sort of whimsical would be another term, right? Goofy, odd, sort of fanciful, and he does at that level. The book is very good. It's very accomplished because he does this throughout. All I'm saying is, I got a little, with my modern sensibility. Again, this book was published in 1933, or maybe not again. We didn't mention 1933. I got a little impatient. So, yeah, but all in all, a fun little read at that level of quirky and droll, not thigh-slapping humor, and at the level of the drawings, which are always amusing. They always bring a little smile, to your face, even if the stories don't have you roaring in the aisles all the time. And there's some interesting aperçus he has about writing, and in particular, the writer of humor. If I may, I like his preface, and I will read briefly. He's talking about writers who write light pieces. And he published this in 1933, but he'd been a journalist for a very long time, and he was a New Yorker writer. He wrote for the New Yorker, okay, under the editorship of Harold Ross. His first book was with E.B. White. We know him through Strunk and White, right?
And Charlotte's Web.
And Charlotte's Web, right? But he was a fine writer apart from those things for the New Yorker for many years. And their first thing they wrote, the title's hilarious, 1929, is Sex Necessary? Just the title, so very droll title. And I haven't read it. I don't know exactly what's going on there, but. And this was not his second. This was about his third or fourth book, 1933. But here he talks about how the sort of person, that the sort of person who writes the kind of stuff he does. And here we go. The notion that such persons are gay of heart and carefree is curiously untrue. They lead, as a matter of fact, an existence of jumpiness and apprehension. They sit on the edge of the chair of literature, capital L, in the house of life, capital L. They have the feeling that they have never taken off their overcoats. Afraid of losing themselves in the larger flight of the 2-volume novel, or even the 1-volume novel, they stick to short accounts of their misadventures because they never get so deep into them but that they feel they can get out. This type of writing is not a joyous form of self-expression, but the manifestation of a twitchiness at once cosmic and mundane. Authors of such pieces have, nobody knows why, a genius for getting into minor difficulties. They walk into the wrong apartments. They drink furniture polish for stomach bitters. They drive their cars into the prized tulip beds of haughty neighbors. They playfully slap gangsters, mistaking them for old school friends. To call such persons humorists, a loose-fitting and ugly word, is to miss the nature of their dilemma and the dilemma of their nature. The little wheels of their invention are set in motion by the damp hand of melancholy. Okay, now that resonated with me. I think that's true. I think the writers, the humorists, at least that I find most amusing, do have that damp hand of melancholy. And Woody Allen, for example, there's sort of that undertone of melancholy to all his stuff. And
What
It's
about
sort of, I think it's sort of a recognition, this damp hand of melancholy. I think it's sort of the recognition of the vanity and futility of it all. You know, life in general and the creative process more specifically. I think that's what he's maybe driving at. Because, and I'll let you get in here, Tim. Sorry to have interrupted you, but I just want to finish with this.
no problem.
It is difficult, and this is again to his preface to this book. It is difficult for such a person to conform to what Ford Madox Ford, famous British author, in his book of recollections has called the sole reason for writing one's memoirs, namely, to paint a picture of one's time. Your short piece writer's time is not Walter Lippmann's time, or Stuart Chase's time, or Professor Einstein's time. It is his own personal time, circumscribed by the short boundaries of his pain and his embarrassment, in which what happens to his digestion, the rear axle of his car, and the confused flow of his relationships with 6 or 8 persons and 2 or 3 buildings is of greater importance than what goes on in the nation or in the universe. He knows vaguely that the nation is not much good anymore. He has read that the crust of the earth is shrinking alarmingly and that the universe is growing steadily colder, but he does not believe that any of the 3 is in half as bad shape as he is. Enormous strides are made in star measurement, theoretical economics, and the manufacture of bombing planes, but he usually doesn't find out about them until he picks up an old copy of Time on a picnic grounds or in the summer house of a friend. He is aware that billions of dollars are stolen every year by bankers and politicians, and that thousands of people are out of work. But these conditions do not worry him a tenth as much as the conviction that he has wasted 3 months on a stupid psychoanalyst, or the suspicion that a piece he has been working on for 2 long days was done much better and probably more quickly by Robert Benchley in 1924. Okay. Robert Benchley was another humorist at the New Yorker. Member of the Algonquin Round Table, Dorothy Parker, George S. Kaufman, and the others. And that's also to give you all sort of a taste for his writing style. He's very erudite, urbane, and yeah, you get the kind of subtle quality of his humor. You wanted to say?
You mentioned that Thurber spoke of the damp hand of melancholy, and you spoke of Woody Allen as being an example of that. I was wondering, do you think Steve Martin fits that category in his writing? You read a book of his a few years ago that you seem to like.
Yeah, sure, he has that. I think so.
Okay. Just wondering.
Full of philosophical ponderings. You know, again, what's the nature of the universe, the human condition? What's the point of it all? Again, this notion of futility, and yeah.
Well, the element that I would say is a thread that runs through the work of Thurber, Woody Allen, and Steve Martin is literary stuff, if not his screenplays. I think he wrote screenplays that he acted in. I think he wrote those movies. Didn't Steve Martin write the screenplays of the movies he was in, or no?
I think he probably had a hand. I don't know.
Okay, because my question is, an element that's in Woody Allen, Steve Martin, and Thurber, if not other, is an element of absurdity. You know, the French theater of the absurd.
Right. Indeed.
L'absurdité. Is that not true?
Très bien. Yes. It's what Errol Flynn, to cite my boy, called, and this is what he felt was sort of a prerequisite for the highest level of art. Errol Flynn. He said it has to have that touch of madness. There you go. And that's what Thurber, Allen, and Martin definitely do have. You know, crazy quality to it, this crazed quality to it.
Steve Martin was famous for saying, "I'm a wild and crazy guy." That was his shtick.
There you have it. And madcap would also help sum it up. The Marx Brothers, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I'm very partial to that sort of stuff. I think, the world is not a place for the sane. I think it helps if you're a little bit nutso to get through it, because it isn't something that you can fathom in a rational way often. And and that's the damp hand of melancholy again. How to make sense of it all. What's the use? And if you don't cry, you laugh.
Kev, I read the book, of course, and I felt the same way you did, that there's some longueurs in there in describing a single scene.
Yeah.
But my favorite chapter was the one on the dog Muggs.
Yeah, I start to like the book more in the second half, and that starts with chapter 6. There are 9 of them, with a sequence of servants, and then the next one is the dog that bit people, the dog Muggs.
Can you read a few passages from the dog who bit people? I like that chapter.
Well, I mean, I don't have them marked, so I might read the wrong ones. Do you have anything marked? You can read it.
I haven't marked it.
Okay, well, look, I think what we can do without having marked it is to simply
just read the first few paragraphs of the dog, just the first few paragraphs, of Muggs.
Here's his picture of the curmudgeonly, disgruntled, often dog Muggs. I like how he's got it's very anthropomorphic, right? He's got his head leaning on his fist, like the thinker in a bad mood.
Yep.
And the dog Muggs. Well, I can't. I'm afraid I'll get a bad one, Tim. Let me see. The dog that bit people. Let me see if I marked anything, despite myself. Okay, here's something. This gives you a taste again of that drawl Thurber humor. It's an Airedale, as you no doubt gathered from the detailed and highly accurate picture. And here's just a section, and I like the final line. Muggs stayed out in the pantry with the mice, lying on the floor, growling to himself, not at the mice, but about all the people in the next room that he would have liked to get at. Mother slipped out into the pantry once to see how everything was going. Everything was going fine. It made her so mad to see Muggs lying there, oblivious of the mice. They came running up to her. That she slapped him, and he slashed at her, but didn't make it. He was sorry immediately, Mother said. He was always sorry, she said, after he bit someone. But we could not understand how she figured this out. He didn't act sorry. Okay. Yeah, how's a dog supposed to act so you can tell he's sorry, right? That's a funny one. And so I think he picks up steam in the second half. And there's another one that I love. There's another section. My favorite chapter was, we can just finish with the dog that bit people. Here's sort of the melancholy dying fall that you have in a lot of the chapters. Muggs died quite suddenly one night. Mother wanted to bury him in the family lot under a marble stone with some such inscription as "Flights of angels, sing thee to thy rest." But we persuaded her it was against the law. In the end, we just put up a smooth board above his grave along a lonely road. On the board, I wrote with an indelible pencil, "Cave canem," right? Latin for beware of dog. Mother was quite pleased with the simple, classic dignity of the old Latin epitaph. That's it. So they loved their dog, but he was a hassle. He was always biting people. Anyway, yeah, must have loved them. My favorite chapter is University Days. And there's a hilarious section. If I'm any judge, and it's an extended section, but this gives us some of the zany, madcap touch of madness, and more than a touch, I would argue, in this passage. So Thurber is now in college, and he's talking about his professors and his classes. Another course that I didn't like, but somehow managed to pass, was economics. I went to that class straight from the botany class, which didn't help me any in understanding either subject. I used to get them mixed up, but not as mixed up as another student in my economics class who came there direct from a physics laboratory. He was a tackle on the football team named Bolinchevich. There's about 5 consonants there shoved together at the end. Some Polish name, right, that you can't pronounce. He's doing this on purpose, Thurber. At that time, Ohio State University had one of the best football teams in the country, and Bolinchevich was one of its outstanding stars. In order to be eligible to play, it was necessary for him to keep up in his studies, a very difficult matter, for while he was not dumber than an ox, he was not any smarter. Most of his professors were lenient and helped him along. None gave him more hints in answering questions, or asked him simpler ones than the economics professor, a thin, timid man named Bassum. One day, when we were on the subject of transportation and distribution, it came Bolinchevich's turn to answer a question. Name one means of transportation, the professor said to him. No light came into the big tackle's eyes. Just any means of transportation, said the professor. Bolinchevich sat staring at him. That is, pursued the professor, any medium, agency, or method of going from one place to another. Bolinchevich had the look of a man who is being led into a trap. You may choose among steam, horse-drawn, or electrically propelled vehicles, said the instructor. I might suggest the one which we commonly take in making long journeys across land. There was a profound silence in which everyone stirred uneasily, including Bolinchevich and Mr. Bassum. Mr. Bassum abruptly broke this silence in an amazing manner. Choo, 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 he said in a low voice, choo, 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 and turned instantly scarlet. He glanced appealingly around the room. All of us, of course, shared Mr. Bassum's desire that Bolinchevich should stay abreast of the class in economics, for the Illinois game, one of the hardest and most important of the season, was only a week off. Toot, 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 toot. Some student with a, Toot, 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 toot. Some student with a deep voice moaned. And we all looked encouragingly at Bolinchevich. Somebody else gave a fine imitation of a locomotive letting off steam. Mr. Bassum himself rounded off the little show. Ding dong, he said hopefully. Bolinchevich was staring at the floor now, trying to think, his great brow furrowed, his huge hands rubbing together, his face red. How did you come to college this year, Mr. Bolinchevich? Asked the professor. Chufa, 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 chufa. My father sent me, said the football player. What on? Asked Bassum. I get an allowance, said the tackle in a low, husky voice, obviously embarrassed. No, said Bassum. Name a means of transportation. What did you ride here on? Train, said Bolinchevich. Quite right, said the professor. Now, Mr. Nugent, will you tell us? Okay, I found that hilarious. Now, that is like straight out of a Marx Brothers film. like Groucho in Horse Feathers, trying to get the kid to get the right answer, typical. And there are more than a few moments like these, but not as much as I would have hoped for. But hey, let's not linger on the negative. Let's accentuate the positive, as the song says. And yeah.
As long as we're on Thurber, and it's not such a big book, so there's not too much to talk about in that book. You did mention the Algonquin Round Table. Can you go into that a little bit more and what the significance of that was to American letters? And who were the members?
Oh, boy, you really got me on the back foot. Well, as I said, George S. Kaufman, who did, in fact, write a couple Marx Brothers plays, which eventually went into, went Hollywood, and they made the film of it. I don't know if he wrote the screenplays. I know he wrote Coconuts, the first Marx Brothers film. And he was there. And Dorothy Parker, Mark Connolly, I think Edna Ferber, who wrote Showboat, wrote the original novel.
What did Dorothy Parker write of note?
Well, she wrote short stories. She wrote volumes of acerbic, witty poetry, being an acerbic, witty woman. And she, I have the Dorothy Parker Reader here. She wrote some very good short stories. And one of her short stories, I think it was 1930, if I have that year correct. She won a prize for like best short story of the year, some big prize, called Big Blonde. It's about a blonde woman who goes from one guy to the next, just sort of trying to make a living off her looks and her sex appeal, and how she ends badly. And it's a good story, very good story. So those, and then what significance did it have for American letters? Well, none in and of itself, because none of these events were recorded or filmed or anything, as far as I know. But you just had the creme de la creme of at least New York wit assembled. At least they fancied themselves to be the creme de la creme. And it was perhaps it helped people to work up their own ideas, work up their jokes. I know there were lots of collaborations. Alexander Wolcott was one of them, again, too. He was a playwright and critic. But it was just a place where they'd meet and crack wise and get tipsy, and sort of an American institution at the time in the 20s. But I can't tell you what significance it.
Where does the name Algonquin, if they're in New York, what does Algonquin refer to?
It was the Algonquin Hotel.
Okay, and it was an actual round table, or
I don't
round table can be just a euphemism for a discussion, no matter where you're at. You could be at a rectangular table, and it could be called a round table discussion.
Yeah, I can't tell you. I don't know.
Okay. So, Kevin, also another aspect of Thurber that you've mentioned a couple times that I'd like you to expand on, if you could. We've got about 15 more minutes to add whatever else we can to the Thurber annals. He was a cartoonist for the New Yorker magazine. We haven't really spoken about the New Yorker as a magazine. Can you tell me the significance of the New Yorker magazine for American letters or literature in general?
Hey, folks, this guy's really catching me off guard today. I don't know. The significance of it? Well,
didn't a lot of great, because let me put it this way. Yeah. Most magazines, you have people from the journalism schools writing journalistic articles, but it seems to me that the New Yorker had a more literary edge to it than most magazines. And you being a man of American literature yourself, do you find the New Yorker to be a compelling literary magazine, or is it a little bit too erudite and sophisticated? You've said in previous chats you're not a fan of New York as a city
No.
in the way that you love LA. So do you kind of dismiss the New Yorker because you're not a big fan of New York as a city?
Well, I don't love present day LA, but I like the LA very much that I grew up in. Um, then the magazine, well, yeah, it's a great addition to American letters, the New Yorker. I can't speak to it today. I have a hunch that I wouldn't necessarily like it. I think it's turned political under the editorship of whomever. But under the editorship of Harold Ross, it seemed to have been pretty politically neutral and wasn't wearing its politics on its sleeve. It produced a lot of great writers, a lot of great writing. S.J. Perelman was one. I don't know if you ever heard of him. He was a satirist, very, very funny guy. He's like the funniest guy in American letters in the 20th century, whom no one has ever heard of, right? S.J. Perelman. Just to give you an idea, he wrote, he was a friend of Raymond Chandler's, by the way. And one time he wrote a parody of the Chandler style called Farewell, My Lovely Appetizer. And it's about a guy who goes to a diner across the street from his detective agency and tries to get a bite to eat. It's hilarious. Takes on all the tropes and all the turns of phrase from the Chandler stuff. S.J. Perelman, yeah, and a lot of other writers got their start there. A couple of the most famous ones are John Cheever and John Updike, who is often called his successor. Not that I am a great fan of either of those two writers, but yeah, they certainly belong in the pantheon of significant American writers. So,
in doing my research, probably the Wikipedia entries, if not the back of this DVD or the forward to the books I'm reading about him, or the book, I should say. Here's my version, My Life in Hard Times. It's just a plain library cover. I got it at the West Valley Library, by the way. So you mentioned the Reseda Library.
yeah.
It's actually called the West Valley Library, and that's the only place that had this book. I had to get it there.
Wow, you drove all the way out there, man.
Well, I have jobs out there anyway in the valley, so when I'm going to one of my jobs, I can dip down and go.
Got it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But in some of my research, I don't remember exactly where, someone was claiming that James Thurber is America's greatest humorist after Mark Twain. Do you agree with that?
No, I can't agree with that. He's very funny. I don't even know if Twain's number one. Twain had a very serious vein, as we have ascertained, this damp hand of melancholy. Okay, so that doesn't discount him. But I don't know. I see Twain at his best as being less of a humorist than kind of a philosophical satirist. We're going to be reading Huckleberry Finn, and as we go through that, I think you'll see what I'm driving at. He had some very profound instincts about the world, straight through to the Mysterious Stranger. Very pessimistic work. And I wouldn't call he was a humorist in his initial stuff, like Innocents Abroad and Roughing It. But as he became more mature, he had a much more elevated agenda, I think, even if he wasn't aware of it. So, humorist. In his lectures, he was certainly a humorist. He was trying to entertain people. I mean, Hal Holbrook spent his whole
Kevin, I think something like Connecticut
career, portraying Mark Twain on the stage as a humorist, and he was. But in his best writing, I don't think he was so much a humorist. I think there was something else going on there. But he could be funny. But yeah, so I don't even know if I accept the premise that Twain is the number one humorist and Thurber the number two. I don't even, there's humor in both of their things, and I would argue that maybe Thurber is even more deliberately humorous. But who's number one, who's number two, three, four, five? I couldn't say. I really don't know.
Okay.
I can't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Comment
was
on that.
thinking another one of the works that would establish Twain as a humorist, or maybe I think you mentioned the word satirist, is Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court.
Right.
There he's going for the humorist angle, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, but Twain doesn't have this light touch. Twain doesn't have this droll kind of touch that I think was sort of emblematic, in particular, of New Yorker writers. You know, Twain could be very heavy-handed and serious and acerbic and yeah, very nasty, you know. So yeah, funny maybe, humorous sure, but not the same way as a Thurber. Just to maybe nuance our definition of what kind of writing he did.
I got a question on Thurber. The title, My Life and Hard Times. It's an odd title. You're basically saying you could have just called it My Life. Why did he add and hard times? What's that in reference to?
You with your title questions again.
Well, this one especially.
Catch me off balance. I somehow don't give as much thought to titles as you do. It's interesting. Nothing wrong with it. It's probably correct. I mean, I tend to just like, yeah, that's a title. That's where I hang my hat, you know, so I can remember it. But
well, the reason I ask you on this one, and I guess I just do it as a habit now, asking what the titles refer to, just to fill the space a little bit at the very least.
Of course. Yeah.
You're obviously going to get a comparison to Hard Times by Charles Dickens when you put the phrase hard times in your title. So
although it didn't occur to me.
I wouldn't think it's an allusion to Dickens. It's not doing that. I wouldn't.
No.
But it's almost superfluous. My life is enough. And then and hard times. Is that a humoristic little
I don't know. Maybe I think it could be just a colloquialism in the American language. I mean, it was in the midst of the Depression then. It was published in 1933.
Oh.
And they were undergoing hard times. In fact, there's a what's his name? The Chicago oral historian. I forget his name, but he wrote a book called Hard Times. It was a collection of interviews he did with people who had gone through the Depression. And this is like 40, 45 years later. Studs Terkel.
Oh.
And he called it Hard Times. I think maybe it's just an idiomatic phrase.
Well, you know what's interesting? I was doing research for our next book coming up, and we'll let the audience know it now. William Saroyan, The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, will be our next work. And when I was looking up, copies of that and Wikipedia research, I saw that it's a collection of short stories about the Depression era and the hard times people went through. So maybe this title is more appropriate to the William Saroyan collection than it is to this Thurber.
Well, a couple of years later, in 1935, which is a year after The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze was published by Saroyan, it came out in 1934. There is definitely a Saroyan connection because Thurber came out with a book called The Middle-Aged Man on the Flying Trapeze.
Really?
Yeah. 1935. I was waiting to get that in. You gave me an opening, so there it is.
Interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's a funny title, especially because this was a big hit. The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze. He published this when he was 26. Big hit for Saroyan. Put him on the map. And I want to say one last thing, and then we can go. And it's about something I wanted really to address here, because I saw an interview on YouTube it was with Thurber and conducted by Alistair Cooke. Remember Alistair Cooke? He wrote the book America. He moderated the series. He was this very urbane British fellow. He was the voice of Masterpiece Theater on PBS for many years, upstairs, downstairs, all that kind of thing. Well, he did an interview in the 50s with Thurber, and he asked him about this, that, and the other, okay? And then they got onto his cartoons and how he became a cartoonist. And Thurber said by accident that he just used to, in the New Yorker office, he shared an office with E.B. White, and he was just, doodling and, throwing stuff in the trash, doing another doodle. Well, one day, E.B. White fished out some of these doodles from the trash. They said, "This is pretty good, Why don't you submit this to Harold Ross, the editor of the New Yorker?" And they did, and Ross, as many people would have, said, "What's this? It looks like a 5-year-old drew it. You want me to publish this?" And the one they specifically submitted to him was a seal on a rock, and with 2 little specks on the horizon. You can't distinguish what the specks, little dots. And the seal, the caption says, "Ah, explorers." Okay. Very Shaggy Dog humor. And Ross wasn't impressed. But later on, he somehow felt that, yeah, Thurber has some talent. We could maybe print a couple of his cartoons. And he went back to Thurber, and Thurber's telling this story to Alistair Cook. That's how I'm getting it on this interview. And he says, and Ross said, "Hey, give me that seal cartoon again." And Thurber said, "Well, I don't have it. I threw it away when you rejected it." He said, "Okay, we'll make another one." And Thurber said, "Well, okay, good," as if you can just replicate something. And he drew the seal and on a rock, but when he got done with the drawing, he thought, well, that rock looks like a bedstead. And so he just kept it on a bedstead, and then he filled out the drawing with a complete bed, then a man and a woman in the bed, married couple apparently. And the seal is like with his flippers over the top of the bedstead. And then the caption is, again, the man and the woman in bed with the seal above in the bedstead. And the woman speaking to the man, "All right, have it your way. You heard a seal bark." Okay. That got printed. Okay. Another example. Thurber had another drawing in mind, and it was a woman at the top of some stairs. And for whatever reason, he was going to have her on all fours. Okay. Well, when he finished drawing the stairs, because he didn't have any training as a draftsman to give it the right perspective, it looked like it was just a bookcase with shelves that he had this woman on all fours. And so, again, he played with it. He put a guy, so the bookcase is up here, the woman's on top on all fours. And then he put a guy in the picture, and then another guy and a woman. The one guy and the woman are a couple. And then the other fellow, the caption says, "This is the present Mrs. Harris." Okay, introducing the man to his present wife. "This is the present Mrs. Harris. The first wife is up there."
Yeah, I saw that one.
Yeah.
Good
okay.
One.
Okay. So this is indicative of the kind of humor that Thurber perpetrates, not only in his cartoons but in his prose. Very subtle, very, very, very soft-edged. And the point I wanted to really make with this is that in both these instances, and Thurber cited them as examples of how a lot of the stuff he came up with, at least in the cartoons, and likely even in the writing, in the texts, came about by accident. And I, as someone who writes, I can testify to this. So a lot of your best stuff comes up just by accident. You're just doodling away and you're writing, and I'm saying, hey, this is pretty good. I can fit this in. I can fit this into my novel, And I'll end with this, a couple quotes. Orson Welles once said, "The definition of a director is a man who presides over accidents." And my favorite quote, and this is one I have here in this bookcase, whenever I become distraught, despairing of my writing, like, oh my goodness, where am I going with this? You know, I don't have writer's block, but sometimes it's like, where's this going? You know, I have no idea. And the Henry James quote is, "We write in the dark, or rather we work in the dark. Our doubt is our passion, and our passion is our task. The rest is the madness of art." Again, the word madness. Okay. So that's sort of the fun of writing, actually. It's being able to surprise yourself with what you're doing. You know, waking up that next morning thinking you know where the novel's going, but you sit down to it and all of a sudden the words take their own course. The characters start to have their own lives, and writers always talk about this. They say, you know, how do you know the book's going well? It's when the characters start doing what they want, and I'm not moving them around on the board like chess pieces. There's some truth to that. It's not just an old saw. It's not some trite thing that writers hear and they think, oh, that's good, and they repeat it. No, there's something to it. When the novel starts to take off on its own and you can't really control it, of course you're guiding it, but when you get that feeling that it has taken on a life of its own, that's where you really get that payoff with the creative act.
Okay. Nice little coda.
Yeah, just to lend you some insight into how maybe people like Thurber or the likes of moi come up with their stuff.
Right. Yeah. Okay, Kev. Well, listen, every time we do this, we get new insights on various aspects of literature. So some nice insights again today. And that brings us to the end of our Thurber survey. Next week, we'll be examining the Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze, a collection of short stories by William Saroyan. So please join us for that. Thanks again, Kevin. We'll see you soon.
And another California writer from Fresno.
Oh, we'll be back to California then. Okay, sounds good.
That's right.
California, right. Here we come, right back where we started from, as the song says. All right. Bye.